Bedtime is supposed to be a happy event for a tired child. For me, it was terrifying. While some children might complain about being put to bed before they had finished watching their film or playing their favorite video game, when I was a child, nighttime was something to truly fear. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it still is. As someone who is trained in the sciences, I cannot prove to you what happened was objectively real, but I can swear that what I experienced was genuine horror. A fear in my life, I'm glad to say, has never been equaled. I will relate to you as best as I can. Make of it what you will, but I'll be glad to get it off my chest. I can't remember exactly when it started, but my apprehension towards falling asleep seemed to correspond with my being moved into a room of my own. I was 8 years old at the time, and until then, I had shared a room, quite happily with my older brother. As is perfectly understandable for a boy 5 years my senior, my brother eventually wished for a room of his own, and as a result, I was given the room at the back of the house. It was a small, narrow, yet oddly enlightened room, large enough for a bed and a couple of chests of drawers, but not much else. I couldn't really complain because, even at that age, I understood that we did not have a large house, and I had no real cause to be disappointed, as my family was both loving and caring. It was a happy childhood during the day. A solitary window looked out onto the back garden. Nothing out of the ordinary, but even during the day, the light which crept into the room seemed almost hesitant. As my brother was given a new bed, I was given the bunk beds, which we used to share. While I was upset about sleeping on my own, I was excited at the thought of being able to sleep in the top bunk, which seemed far more adventurous to me. From the very first night, I remembered a strange feeling of unease creeping slowly from the back of my mind. I laid on the top bunk, staring down my action figures and cars across the green-blue carpet. As imaginary battles and adventures took place between the toys on the floor, I couldn't help but feel that my eyes were being slowly drawn towards the bottom bunk, as if something was moving in the corner of my eye. Something which did not want to be seen. The bunk was empty, impeccably made with a dark blue blanket tucked in neatly, partially covered two rather bland white pillows. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was a child, and the noise slipping under my door from my parents' television bathed me in a warm sense of safety and well-being. I fell asleep. When you awaken from a deep sleep to something moving or stirring, it can take a moment for you to truly understand what is happening. The fog of sleep hangs over your eyes and ears even when lucid. Something was moving. There was no doubt about that. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Everything was dark, almost pitch black, but there was enough light creeping in from outside to outline that narrowly suffocating room. Two thoughts appeared in my mind almost simultaneously. The first was that my parents were in bed because the rest of my house lay both in darkness and silence. The second thought turned to the noise, a noise which had obviously woken me. As the last cobwebs of sleep withered from my mind, the noise took on a more familiar form. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving, the cold wind whistling through a tree outside, a neighbor's footsteps uncomfortably close, or, in this case, the simple sound of bed sheets rustling in the dark. That was it. Bed sheets rustling in the dark, as if some disturbed sleeper was attempting to get all too comfortable in the bottom bunk. I lay there in disbelief, thinking that the noise was either my imagination, or perhaps just my pet cat finding somewhere comfortable to spend the night. It was then that I noticed my door shut, as it happened as I had fallen asleep. Perhaps my mom had checked in on me while my cat sneaked into the room then. Yes, that must have been it. I turned to face the wall, closing my eyes in the vain hope that I could fall back to sleep. As I moved, the rustling noise from underneath me ceased. I thought that I may have disturbed my cat, but quickly I realized that my visitor in the bottom bunk was much less mundane than my pet trying to sleep, and much more sinister. As if alerted to and disgruntled by my presence, the disturbed sleeper began to toss and turn violently, like a child having a tantrum in their bed. I could hear the sheets twist and turn with increasing force. Fear then gripped me, not like the subtle sense of unease I had experienced earlier, but now potent and terrifying. My heart raced as my eyes panicked, scanning the almost impenetrable room. The almost impenetrable darkness. I let out a cry. As most young boys do, I instinctively shouted on my mother. I could hear something stir on the other side of the house, but as I began to breathe a sigh of relief that my parents were coming to save me, the bunk bed suddenly started to shake violently, as if gripped by an earthquake, scraping against the wall. I could hear the sheets below me thrashing around, as if tormented by a malice. I did not want to jump down to safety, as I feared the thing in the bottom bunk would reach out and grab me, pulling me into the darkness. So I stayed there, white knuckles clenching my own blanket like a shroud of protection. The wait seemed like an eternity. The door finally and thankfully bursted open. I lay bathed in light while the bottom bunk, the resting place of my unwanted visitor, lay empty and peaceful. I cried, and my mother consoled me. Tears of fear, followed by relief, steamed down my face. Yet, though all of the horror and relief, I did not tell her why I was so upset. I cannot explain it. But it was as though whatever had been the bottom bunk would return if I even so much as spoke of it, or uttered a single syllable of its existence. Whether that was the truth, I do not know. But as a child, I felt as if that unseen menace remained close, listening. My mother lay in the empty bunk, promising to stay there until morning. Eventually, my anxiety diminished. Tiredness pushed me back toward sleep, but I remained restless, waking several times momentarily to the sound of rustling bedsheets. I remember the next day wanting to go anywhere, be anywhere, but in that narrow, suffocating room. It was a Saturday, and I played outside, quite happily with my friends. Although our house was not large, we were lucky to have a long sloping garden in the back. We played there often, as much of it was overgrown, and we could hide in the bushes, climbing the huge sycamore tree, which towered above all else, and easily imagined ourselves in the throes of a great adventure in some untainted exotic land. As fun as it was, occasionally my eye would turn to that small window, ordinary, slight, and innocuous. But for me, that thin boundary was a looking-glass into a strange cold pocket of dread. Outside, the lush green surroundings of my garden, filled with the smiling faces of my friends, could not extinguish the creeping feeling clawing its way up my spine, each hair standing on end. The feeling of something in that room, watch me, play, waiting for the night when I would be alone, eagerly filled with hate. It may sound strange to you, but by the time my parents ushered me back into the room for the night, I said nothing. I didn't protest. I didn't even make an excuse as to why I couldn't sleep there. I simply and silently walked into the room, climbed a few steps into the top bunk, and then waited. As an adult, I would be telling everyone about my experience, but even at that age, I felt almost silly to be talking about something which I really had no evidence for. I would be lying, however, if I said this was my primary reason. I still felt that this thing would be enraged if I so much as spoke of it. It's funny how certain words can remain hidden from your mind, no matter how blatant or obvious they are. One word came to me that second night, lying there in the darkness, alone, frightened, aware of a rotten change in the atmosphere, a thickening of the air as if something was displaced it. As I heard the first casual twist of the bedsheets below, the first anxious increase of my heartbeat at the realization that something was once again in the bottom bunk, that word, a word which had sent me into exile, filtered up through my consciousness, breaking free of my repression, gasping for air, screaming, etching, and carving itself into my mind. Ghost. As the thought came to me, as my unwelcome visitor had ceased moving, the bedsheets lay calm and dormant, but they had been replaced by something far more hideous, a slow, rhythmic, rasping breath, heaved and escaped from that thing below. I could imagine his chest rising and falling with each sordid, wheezing, and garb-led breath. I shuddered, and hoped beyond all hope that it would leave without occurrence. The house lay, as it had been the previous night, in thick blanket of darkness. Silence prevailed, all but for the perverted breath of my, as yet, unseen bunkmate. I lay there terrified. I just wanted this thing to go, to leave me alone. What did it want? Then, something unmistakably chilling transpired. It moved, and moved in a way different from before. When it threw itself around in the bottom bunk, it seemed unrestrained, without purpose, almost animalistic. This movement, however, was driven by awareness, with purpose, with a goal in mind. For that thing laying there in the darkness, that thing which seemed intent of terrorizing a young boy, calmly and nonchalantly sat up. Its labored breath had become louder, as now only a mattress and a flimsy wooden slates separated my body from the unearthly breath below. I lay there, my eyes filled with tears. A fear which more words could not relate to, you, or anyone else coursed through my veins. I would not have believed that this fear could have been heightened, but I was so wrong. I imagined that this thing would look like sitting there listening from below my mattress, hoping to catch the slightest hint that I was awake. Imagination then turned to unnerving reality. It began to touch the wooden slates, which my mattress sat on. It seemed to caress them carefully, running what I imagined to be fingers and hands across the surface of the wood. Then, with great force, it prodded angrily between the two slats into the mattress. Even though the padding, it felt as though someone had viciously stuck their fingers into my side. I let out an almighty cry and the wheezing shaking. The moving thing in the bunk below replied in kind of violently vibrating the bunk as it had done the night before. Small flakes of paint pounded onto my blankets from the wall as the frame of my bed scraped along it, backwards and forwards. Once again, I was bathed in light, and there stood my mother, loving, caring, as she always was, with a comforting hug and calming words which eventually subdued my hysteria. Of course, she asked me what was wrong, but I could not say. I dared not say. I simply said one word and over again. Nightmare. This pattern of events continued for weeks, if not months. Night after night, I would awaken to the sound of rustling sheet. With each cry, the bed would shake violently, stopping with the arrival of my mother, who would spend the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, seemingly unaware of the sinister force torturing her son nightly. Along the way, I managed to fight illness. A few times, I come up with the other less than truthful reason for sleeping in my parents' bed, but more often than not, I would be alone for the first few hours of each night in that place, the room where the light from outside did not sit right, alone with that thing. With time, you can become desensitized to almost anything, no matter how horrific. I had come to realize that, for whatever reason, could not harm me when my mother was present. I am sure the same would have been the same for my father, but as loving as he was, waking him from sleep was almost impossible. After a few months, I had grown accustomed to my nightly visitor. Do not mistake this for some unearthly friendship. I detested that thing. I still feared it greatly. I could almost sense its desire in its personality, if you could call it that, one filled with a perverted and twisted hatred yet longing for me, or perhaps all things. My greatest fears were realized in the winter. The days grew short, and longer nights merely provided this wretch with more opportunities. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother, a wonderfully kind and gentle woman, had deteriorated greatly since the death of my grandfather. My mother was trying her best to keep her in the community as long as possible. However, dementia is a cruel and degenerative illness, robbing a person of their memories one day at a time. Soon, she recognized none of us, and it became clear that she would need to be moved from her house to a nursing home. Before she could be moved, my grandmother had a few particularly difficult few nights, and my mother decided that she would stay with her. As much as I loved my grandmother, and felt nothing but anguish at her illness, to this day I feel guilty that my first thought was not of her, but of what my nightly visitor may do should it become aware of my mother's absence, her presence being the one thing which I was sure was protecting me from the full horror of this thing's reach. I was rushed home from school that day, and immediately wrenched the bed sheets and mattress from the lower bunk, removing all the slates and placing an old desk, a chest of drawers, and some chairs which we kept in the cupboard where the bottom bunk used to be. I told my father I was making an office, which he found adorable, but I would be damned if I'd give that place a thing to sleep for one more night. The darkness approached. I lay there knowing my mother was not in the house. I didn't know what to do. My only impulse was to sneak into her jewelry box and take a small family crucifix, which I had seen there before. While my family was not yet religious, at that age, I still believed in God and hoped that somehow this would protect me. Although fearful and anxious, while gripping the crucifix under my pillow tightly in one hand, sleep eventually came and I drifted off to dream. I hoped that I would awake in the morning without incidents. Unfortunately, that night was the most terrifying of all. I woke gradually. The room was once again dark. As my eyes adjusted, I could gradually make out the window and the door, and the walls, some toys on the shelf, and, even to this day, I shudder to think of it, for there was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. The room felt lifeless, yet not empty. The nightly visitor, that unwelcomingly wheezing, hate-filled thing which had terrorized me night after night, was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Utter terror had shaken the very sound from my voice. I lay motionless. If I could not scream, I did not want to let it know that I was awake.